Good morning and welcome to the 2025 Grant Cycle webinar for the Land and Water Conservation Fund Grant Program. My name is Naomi Enciso and I will be with you for the next 2 hours. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available on our website along with a copy of the PDF slides. Links to the presentation and more will be shared throughout the presentation. We do have a Q&A box available at any time during the presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to submit those there. With me today, I have Jody Belfi. She's our Recreational Trails Grant Program Coordinator, and Michelle Scalise, the Grants and Community Programs Section Manager, and they are both keeping an eye on any questions coming in. So again, to get started, I'm Naomi Enciso. I coordinate this Land and Water Conservation Fund grant program, and this is my contact information, which will be shared again at the end of the presentation. In today's webinar, I will give you an overview of the Land and Water Conservation Fund program, who may apply, the schedule for the 2025 grant cycle, the process to apply, and other important information that you'll need to know. I'll also share about other grant opportunities that may be available to you, starting with the other recreation grant programs that we offer here at OPRD. So if you're not already familiar, these are the list of 5 recreation grant programs and the relevant staff contact. We have a couple of opportunities opening soon, including Land and Water, Recreational Trails Grant Program, and the County Opportunity Grant Program is open now. Of these 5 programs, the Local Government Grant Program is our largest program, providing for funds for outdoor recreation projects on lands managed by local governments, and this program opens in January. Applicant and project eligibility varies for each, but some of your projects could be eligible for more than Land and Water. A couple of other plugs for other grant programs. There's the Travel Oregon Recreation Ready program. If your project is not quite ready for construction and could use some help with the planning phases of the project, Travel Oregon Recreation Ready is a really good resource for you. There's also the Oregon State Marine Board. If your project consists of any boating facilities or waterway access, that's another really good program. There's also the United States Tennis Association Tennis Venue Services Program. From tennis court resurfacing and lighting upgrades to full-scale construction projects, this program can be a great resource. They offer technical assistance, business consulting, advocacy support, digital tools, and grant funding. Their program is available on a rolling application and is reviewed on an ongoing basis. Grant awards are on a first-come, first-served basis, depending on the grant budget of the program. And then just to caveat that only tennis courts are available for this program, pickleball courts are not eligible. Okay, so diving right into Land and Water. The Land and Water Conservation Fund program has awarded over $90 million in grant funds for Oregon public recreational areas and facilities since its inception. The LWCF program was established by Congress in the 1960s to provide funds to preserve and develop outdoor recreation resources, including parks, trails, and wildlife lands. The program is administered by the National Park Service and passes through the states to state and local governments. It's made up of 2 programs. There's the stateside program, which is the program that OPRD administers. It provides matching grants to states and through states to local units of government. And in addition to helping fund outdoor recreation areas and facilities, it also funds the development of the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. The other program is the federal side, which provides funds to federal land management agencies to acquire lands, waters, and interests to achieve natural, cultural, wildlife, and recreation management. Some of you may have heard about threats to LWCF funding either in the news or advocacy alerts this year. Some of that was specific to the federal side, which OPRD is not involved with. So for now, business as usual. We still do have access to our normal state level of funding for this program. Of course, things can change, but again, for now, it's business as usual. This is a pass-through grant program where the state is the recipient of the grant funds and is responsible for ensuring compliance with the grant requirements, both during the project and after project completion. The applicant or the project sponsor shares in those requirements. Eligible applicants include cities, counties, towns, Native American tribes, qualified special purpose districts, and a handful of state agencies. All applicants compete with the same criteria. We fund many types of projects, including restrooms, playgrounds, interpretive signage, trails, splash pads, and much, much more. The proposed facility must be under the control and tenure of the public agency that sponsors the grant. The project sponsor must possess sufficient title and adequate legal control of the property to be within the LWCF boundary area in order to assure and provide reasonable assurances that a conversion will not occur. No approval will be given for development of facilities on leased land, with the exception of the last two bullet points on the screen. We offer 4 application types: acquisition, development, rehabilitation, and combination, which combines acquisition of real property with either development or restoration work. The minimum grant request is $50,000. We do not have a set maximum amount that you can request. However, the maximum grant request for a single project can't exceed the total funds available for the grant cycle. In this grant cycle, we're anticipating about $10 or $11 million available. All applications require 50% match, and we'll talk much more about that in the presentation later. This is a reimbursement program, and expenses must be paid for by the grantee and submitted to OPRD for reimbursement, along with proof of payment. Okay, so let's talk acquisition. Acquisitions may be accomplished through purchase, transfer, or by donation. Grant applications for projects involving acquisition require proof of willing seller or donor and compliance with the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition policies. It's important that you do not make any payments for property or acquire the property before you've received the federal award. Doing so will deem the application ineligible unless you've been granted a waiver of retroactivity. A waiver of retroactive costs means that the cost will be eligible for LWCF assistance if the agreement is later approved. A waiver is only an acknowledgement of the need for immediate action. It does not imply nor assure the approval of the project. Retroactive costs are incurred at the risk of the applicant. And if this sounds like something that may apply to you, contact me separately and we'll work together on the waiver, which requires approval from the National Park Service and from Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. Funding may be used to acquire property for which development of outdoor recreation is planned for a future date. Development of the site should occur within 3 years of the date of acquisition. And in the application, we will need a conceptual design plan. In the interim, between acquisition and development, the property must be open for public recreation purposes that the land is capable of supporting or that can be achieved with minimal public investment. LWCF funding may be used to acquire a structure only if it will be used to support or is necessary to achieve outdoor recreation goal for the site. For example, a garage or a storage building that can be converted to an operation and maintenance shed. You have to describe all of the existing improvements and structures on the property when you submit your application. The application will go through an environmental screening, and the scope of the environmental review includes the lands to be acquired and the proposed public outdoor recreation uses intended for the property to be completed within 3 years of acquisition. More on that later in the presentation. For acquisition projects, we also do ask for a preliminary title report, a Yellow Book appraisal, and an appraisal review. Initiating the appraisal and appraisal review are the responsibility of the applicant. An appraisal is not required if the sponsor or if the project, if the property is valued at $25,000 or less. So in that case, a waiver valuation can be prepared instead of an appraisal. If you're in the process of ordering an appraisal, we recommend letting the appraiser know that you'll need a review as well, so that the two appraisers can coordinate their respective work. If you already have a Yellow Book appraisal that was completed within the last year and you have not completed the appraisal review yet, contact me separately. You may be able to submit your application with just the appraisal for now and get the review once you know if your project has been recommended for funding. As with all projects that receive a Land and Water Conservation Fund grant, the facility or park must be dedicated and open for general public outdoor recreation use. Acquisitions can be for a completely new recreation area or can add on to an existing public outdoor recreation facility. Examples of ineligible acquisitions include historic sites and structures, museums, facilities to meet a public school's minimum site requirements, or areas that exclude the public. And these are just more examples of ineligible acquisition projects. Development and rehabilitation projects. The application for both of these types is identical, and the reason why we separate them, it's just for internal tracking purposes. They both use the same criteria, same questions. So for development and rehabilitation type projects, we're going to need from you facilities. They will need a site plan that shows the proposed improvements and their location within the park area. Facilities may be developed on land and water owned in fee simple by the participating agency or where ownership of less than fee interests, such as easements, provide permanent control of the property corresponding with the proposed development. All less than fee simple interests must be described in the application and indicated on the LWCF boundary map, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. Applications will be screened for potential environmental impacts to determine the appropriate process to conduct under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Federal permits don't necessarily need to be in hand when you submit your application to the state, but you will need to have them before we can submit the official application to the National Park Service, which doesn't happen for a few months after the competition process is over, but just something to remind you if you haven't already started that process or those conversations to get started on that now. Development projects create new outdoor recreation facilities in accordance with either the State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, recreation elements of a local comprehensive plan, master park plan, or other local planning efforts. The list of eligible projects is vast, and the list here on the screen is not all-inclusive. Generally, if your project is for the purpose of public outdoor recreation, if you're an eligible applicant and you can satisfy all of the other eligibility requirements, such as having control and tenure of the property, then your project could be eligible. We oftentimes see projects involving ball fields, outdoor recreation sports, playgrounds, and lots of restrooms. A development project may consist of one improvement or a group of related improvements. As far as support facilities, we don't typically pay for indoor structures unless it's a support facility for outdoor recreation, such as restrooms or, to store outdoor recreation maintenance equipment. Parking, landscaping, pathways are also other types of eligible support facilities. These are some example of projects that would not be eligible to receive funding. Indoor facilities, professional facilities, routine maintenance and repair, exhibit areas. These are ineligible indoor facilities, so study areas, restaurants, meeting rooms. For rehabilitation, major rehab projects involve the restoration or partial reconstruction of eligible recreation areas and facilities, which is necessitated by one or more of the circumstances listed on the screen. Rehabilitation is not the same as routine maintenance and repairs that should be kept up with regularly, such as cleaning, painting, and minor repairs. So up next, we're going to start talking about readiness requirements. I'll take a quick pause here and see if there's any questions about any of the slides that I've talked about. Feel free to drop your question into the Q&A.
Hey, Naomi. Someone just asked if rustic yurts or cabins are eligible for funding within a campground.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then it looks like Michelle is answering a question, but I'll just say it out loud for the group. Someone's asking if for acquisition projects, if the environmental screening is based on the conceptual design plan.
It is.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. Oh, and another one. What about outdoor kitchen facilities like a barbecue, grill, shelter, sink, things like that?
Yep, we see those pretty often.
Great. I'll still put some answers in the chat so you can all see. And nothing else.
Nothing else. All right. So moving on here. Here we go. Readiness requirements. So LWCF is a shovel-ready program, which means we want to see most of the front-end work complete and the project as close to shovel-ready as possible by the time you apply. We do allow for cost for final design and engineering, plans and specifications, and permits in the budget. However, these costs are limited to 15% of the total budget. You may be approved to incur these costs before the grant award and still include them in your budget. For land use, in your application form, you're going to find a land use compatibility statement. The purpose of this form is to ensure that the activity is compliant with local land use rules. You'll submit this form to the city or the county, and they'll fill out a section that notes whether the activity complies. The land use compatibility statement form may include comments about required permits, so do pay attention to what you're getting back. If a conditional use permit is required, depending on the details, OPRD may make the notice to proceed contingent on an approved conditional use permit or require it with the application. We'll want more information about the timeline for the conditional use permit, why it's not in place if it's not already, and what other factors could impact the permit approval. Federal permits, as mentioned before, must be in hand by the time we submit the official application to National Park Service. Sometimes we can be granted a special condition that would allow the award to be released without, being able to start any of the actual project while we're waiting for the permit, but this is not always guaranteed. Some of the environmental review and cultural resource review may be done during the application or oftentimes before the application. Applications will go through a Section 106 consultation. In this process, we must consider the effects of actions on historic properties and ensure reasonable action is taken to avoid, minimize, or mitigate harm to resources. Prior to formal proposal submission to NPS for review and approval, staff will initiate the Section 106 consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office or Tribal Historic Preservation Office, if applicable, and other consulting parties to define the area of potential effect, identify historic properties within the area, and determine whether the proposal has the potential to affect any historic properties. We want to coordinate this work as early as possible in case additional work is required. Likely, I'll start consultations with SHPO even before the Grant Advisory Committee meets and makes a recommendation, just to get ahead of any possible delays in grant funding and starting the project. There's usually multiple 30-day consultation periods in that process. If you know your project area has been previously surveyed for cultural resources, please contact me separately so we can determine what needs to be submitted with your application. If you know that there has not been a survey done, then more likely than not, you can expect that you'll need one. NPS conducts the consultation with the tribes, and depending on the results of consultation, additional work may be required, including surveys, inadvertent discovery plans, mitigation, etc. If you do have to do a survey through this consultation, we'll work with you to revise your budget because we can't include those costs in pre-award match in these cases. We do encourage you to work in survey costs, but some may not be known until after consultation. The NEPA process is intended to help public officials make decisions that are based on understanding of environmental consequences and take actions to protect, restore, and enhance the environment. Land and Water Conservation Fund program is a federally funded program, which means we do have to do NEPA and move forward the projects for funding. We highly recommend that you start the environmental review immediately as soon as possible, as you will need to include this with your application. There's two areas where you can download the environmental review packet. So you can either find it on our website under the application and forms section. You'll see it here. It was updated just a couple of weeks ago. And it's also going to be one of the files included in your application that you can download. The review includes consultation with state natural resource agencies, including the Department of State Lands, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Department of Environmental Quality. You may also need to consult with other agencies depending on your project. In particular, you'll want to contact the Oregon Department of Transportation if you have any highway or one of their resources by your park to see if they have future plans for the area. If your project is near or at an existing boating access site, or if the project creates waterway access, you'll want to contact the Oregon State Marine Board. The instructions on how to complete the steps and the forms you'll need, again, are downloadable off of the application online or from our website. For your consultation with these agencies, you'll need to provide them with a map and a site plan of the proposed project, a transmittal memo describing the request you're making of them and your project, and a consultation form which they will use to provide any comments. You'll also include a draft of the Environmental Resources Survey, which is in the application and revision form, another form that's included in your application, completed to the best of your abilities. For that consultation, the entire application and revision form does not need to be filled out. There are some questions that wouldn't be necessarily relevant to their review, such as the financial section. State natural resource agencies use the consultation form to communicate requirements, such as permits needed, to inform you if your project may have adverse effects to a natural resource, or other recommendations for improvements. Comments you receive can serve you in helping complete the environmental portion of the application and revision form, which will inform OPRD and NPS of the recommended NEPA pathway. Please do use the transmittal form and memo that are provided to you in this year's land and water application. If you've applied to any of our other grant programs, you might remember that some of those programs require a similar environmental review. However, our program uses a unique set of questions directly from the federally created A&R form, application and revision form. So use the forms provided to you with this application packet. Reviewing agencies must be given no less than 30 days for their review. If they require additional time or information, you'll need to follow up with them to address the comments that they've provided. You don't need to send me the back and forth between you and that agency. We'll just need the final comments to be submitted with your application. And if you don't receive a response back by the time that the application is due, that's okay. In that case, upload just a copy of the email that you sent those agencies requesting comment so that we can have an idea of when a response may be received or if we need to follow up. So please do not pressure those agencies to provide a response sooner than 30 days. They're reviewing not just the applications coming into Land and Water, they're also reviewing any of our other grant programs that are open, along with, any other external agencies that I'm not aware of. So this is a new process. It's a new requirement as well. Applicants will consult with the Oregon Fish and with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But consulting with the Oregon State Fish and Wildlife is not new. The part that's new is consulting at the federal level. So we'll need you to run what's called an IPAC report. The IPAC stands for Information for Planning and Consultation. So as you're filling out the environmental resource survey that's included in that application and revision form, it does ask you for any impacts to species and habitat in the area. And so running this IPAC report will help you in completing that question. It also asks about migrating birds and eagles. So that's information that you'll get from the IPAC report. For any projects that are recommended for funding next spring, I will consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, this consultation step is new, and as of last grant cycle, it was not required, but because it's a federally funded program, we are now required to consult. There's a link in the application material. It's also on our website under the resources section where you can run the report. Using these links that we've provided, they will take you to a page where an account is not required. It skips the login page, so you can just run it pretty quickly. So the way that you do it, once you click on the link, it'll take you to what looks like this here on the screen. You will kind of highlight the area of your project. So it does not need to be exact, just kind of a brief area. It'll run a report in the background, and here we go. So defining the project area, and it'll create for you a resource list. So you'll want to make sure to review this and upload a copy of the printed resource list to your application. When we consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they may have questions or need more information to assess whether species or their habitat will be impacted. For example, they may ask what months you'll be doing certain work or ask what type of equipment you'll use. But running this ahead of when we do the actual consultation will give you an idea if there's any species or habitat that you have to kind of plan around. Environmental review is required for all Land and Water Conservation Fund projects. The application and revision form, or A&R form, is the narrative portion of the federal application. A completed A&R form will guide the state and the project sponsor along the appropriate NEPA pathway to produce the level of environmental analysis and documentation required for the proposed project. And later in the presentation, I think I'll show you an example of what the form looks like. it's specifically the environmental resources section. The responses on that form will be updated at least once, if not more, during the application process as it goes through different levels of review, mostly at the federal level. So as you're completing the A&R, keep the responses brief and straightforward and leave out any additional narrative that's not required. The purpose of that form is not for competition of funds. It's a form that's used by the National Park Service to understand the project, understand any financial risk, and see how it competed at the state level, as well as review any environmental impact. We usually ask for it up front because it does take quite a bit of time to prepare the first draft that will be shared with NPS for their preliminary review. I'm going to pause there because the next couple of slides talk about maps and site plans. Are there any questions about these last couple of slides?
Nothing yet in the chat that hasn't been answered, Naomi. Oh. So yeah, actually good question. So for the environmental resource survey, how do we discuss historic and cultural resources if we don't have a survey done yet? Which is usually the situation. So Naomi, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so you can usually leave that blank, especially if there has not been a survey that you're aware of, because during the process we'll um, go through the consultation, and eventually when we submit the final version of that form, that the appropriate box will be checked. So for this first draft, if you're not sure if a survey is done or it's in question, you can just put unknown for now.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Nothing else that I
Nothing else.
see.
Okay. All right. Moving on to boundary maps. I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, LWCF boundary map. What it is, it must clearly define the area to be included under the conversion provisions of the Act. So sometimes, especially if you've been around for some time, you might hear this being referred to as a 6F map, which is referring to Section 6F3 of the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act. The protected LWCF boundary area will normally exceed the areas directly receiving LWCF assistance in order to assure the protection of a viable recreation area. It's very important that the project sponsor, the state, and the National Park Service all understand what's going on in the entire park and not just in the project area. Exceptions for boundaries that would apply to a lesser area may be considered only when it can be shown that the area is self-supporting. These requests are reviewed on a case-by-case basis by the National Park Service and by OPRD prior to award of a grant. Early coordination is strongly recommended. For acquisition projects, in no case will the LWCF boundary area be less than the acquired area that was received LWCF assistance. And here is just an example of what a boundary map looks like. I'll go into more details here in just a moment. But please do understand that LWCF boundaries do have legal protection from the LWCF Act. Conversions usually happen when property interests are conveyed for private or non-public outdoor recreation uses, either private or public. Unallowable indoor facilities are developed within the boundary without approval from the National Park Service or NPS. If you've received an LWCF grant, say several decades ago, to rehabilitate a restroom building, for instance, then chances are likely that the entire park is protected by LWCF. And sometimes we get the question, can I just pay back a grant amount to resolve a conversion? And the answer to that is no. The only way to remedy a conversion is to purchase and develop replacement property into public outdoor recreation. There's a whole lot more criteria that needs to be checked off and many, many steps in this process. It's lengthy, expensive, and at times it can be frustrating. Here's an example of an acceptable LWCF boundary map. The list here on the screen reflects items that must be reflected on the map. On our website and in the application, you're going to find a maps checklist that's available, and it tells you exactly what we'll need in each of the maps, including the boundary map and the site plan, as well as the vicinity map. Um, so in this example, you see that they've checked off all of the items that were required with the exception of any leases. So in this case, there were no areas that are being leased either to the sponsor or from the sponsor. So I think that if that's the case for your project, it could be helpful to just include a note that no easements are in the area. So just so that we know it wasn't something that was overlooked. Oftentimes our OPRD GIS staff can lend a hand in creating the final map that we include with your official application to National Park Service. We do still need you to submit a draft with your application, and then if need be, I can tap our GIS folks for help. Here's the same boundary map, but the list has changed over here. These are items that are not necessarily required to be included on the map, but are pretty helpful if you can include them. So other things that are really great about this map are the satellite view, because it makes it easy to see the boundary in relation to the surrounding area. Access points have been identified and surrounding tax lots are easily identifiable. Here's another example of an LWCF boundary map. I wanted to show this example here because when we received the application from the sponsor in 2018, the park size at the time was 7.42 acres. And at some point during the construction of the LWCF development project, the project sponsor acquired additional property that expanded the park. And so upon closeout of the grant, the existing parkland, so the 7.42 acres, along with the newly acquired property that was not a part of the LWCF project, resulted in a larger area being protected. So you could see here, this kind of area and this access point were sections that were added and expanded upon after the original application was submitted to us. If your park has an existing LWCF boundary and that park's footprint has grown over the years since the grant was closed, the expanded area is not protected by LWCF unless you receive a new grant from the program or if we process a conversion. The reason why this expanded area was included is because we were still in process of closing out an open grant. So there was some federal activity going on there. And then lastly, I wanted to show these examples because they are LWCF boundary maps that have been created by our GIS staff. If the boundary map that you submit with your application satisfies all of the requirements, then we probably will use that map when we submit your official application to the National Park Service. But if it needs a little bit more help, that's when I may tap our GIS folks to assist. And of course, I'll run the draft by you before we submit it to NPS. Our staff do actually map all boundaries in our public-facing online map. And so sometimes it's easier for them if they create the map up front to begin with. But again, we do still ask for your drafts so that they have something to work off of. Another requirement in all applications is a site plan. A good site plan includes the proposed work, the existing facilities, and their location in relation to the overall park. While the bullet points listed on the screen here are not all required, they can be helpful to include if possible. In some instances, the site plan can be the boundary map depending on the project. If combining the two gets pretty busy and makes it difficult to read, then in those cases, it may be best to separate the two. The site plan is submitted with the application and is used for understanding the proposed scope of work. We use it in our tribal consultation, and we use it for compliance. Upon completion of the project, we're going to ask for a completed site plan to assure that all the elements you agreed to complete were done and that their location hasn't changed. And if it has changed, then we should have been notified prior to making any major, changes just in case additional federal compliance is required. Here's an example of a site plan. This example is good because it identifies the existing elements in the park, it identifies the proposed renovations or additions, and it shows where the project area is situated within the whole park. You don't necessarily need a professional rendering to submit a site plan. You can, get away with just submitting a picture of the park and handwriting the elements so long as it's legible and easy to identify. And here's an example that I wanted to show of a before and after. So with the application, again, we'll need you to reflect where the proposed project areas will take place. And upon completion of the grant, we're going to ask for a similar type site plan, but now showing what has been completed. So you'll notice some of the labeling has changed where it's no longer proposed, it's now an existing restroom. Okay, so I think I'll take a quick pause here because I'm going to dive into some additional considerations. So any questions about mapping or any of the site plans required?
Naomi, there is a question about maps of the APE, which I'm going to assume is more about like the SHPO and US Fish and Wildlife um, pieces and those maps. And Allison, you can add a new question if you're means something else. But the question is, with the APE, can they submit maps beforehand for your review? So if you could talk a little bit about kind of where the APE maps come into play and what that process is like.
Yes, thank you, Jody. Yes, you can submit those ahead for review. Usually I request for those maps anyways when I'm submitting my initial consultation with to the State Historic Preservation Office. So if you have any additional maps that you find might be helpful, especially if they reflect, any digging, so how far you're digging, where any staging areas could be, points of access for construction, all of that information is super helpful if you can provide a map with that information.
And maybe quickly, Naomi, if you just want to talk about that first step of the SHPO process and what that looks like in regards to APA concurrence.
Yeah, so in the preliminary first consultation that we do with the SHPO, we are notifying them that there's a project that may receive or is seeking to receive assistance from a federal program. We're providing to them kind of an initial area of potential effect map, and we're requesting for their concurrence. So what they do is they'll take a look at what we provided. They'll look into their database, and if they see that it's been surveyed or if it hasn't, they'll let us know and always, recommend to proceed with caution. Does that help?
Thanks, Naomi.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I don't see any others.
Okay. All right. So moving on here, a couple of additional considerations when applying to the program. So Build America, Buy America Act went into effect May of 2022, and it requires that all of the iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in the project be produced in the United States, unless subject to an approved waiver or exemption. All of the agreements and any amendments we received do include this language. There is so in the past, our last couple of grant cycles, we have submitted a review request to the National Park Service where they can review all of, what the project will complete and let us know if it's considered infrastructure or not. And if it's not considered infrastructure, then we are exempt from having the requirements of Build America, Buy America applied to the project. So in the past, we've submitted all of the projects from the last couple of grant cycles, and they've all come back exempt from the requirements. Um, those projects included things like playgrounds, parking areas, pedestrian bridges. There was a visitor center, trails, campgrounds, and more. So usually we cannot submit that review request until after the grant award has been received from the National Park Service. There is information on that federal award that I need in order to complete the review that goes to NPS. So just know that it's something I'll submit for your project if you are recommended for award and do eventually get the award from NPS. If after the review request, it's determined that your project is in fact infrastructure and is not exempt from the requirements, then there's a couple of other options we can help you to consider if it's something you're interested in. There's a general applicability waivers. Not guaranteed that you'll receive one, but we can always help you try. There's a small grants waiver, so it's for projects under $250,000. And then there's a de minimis waiver, which waives up to 5% of the total applicable project costs up to a maximum of 1 million. So a couple of options for you there. So looking ahead at our schedule for this grant cycle, applications will open online officially this coming Monday, the 15th, and the deadline to submit will be November 17th. Applications are all done online. However, on our website, we do have a couple of pre-award worksheets that I'll show you later in the slides that we recommend you start your applications with. Those worksheets are available now and contain most, if not all, of the application questions. So after you submit your application, we're going to do some technical review and be in contact with you, probably going back a little bit, requesting more information at times or clarification, especially if you're missing a couple of documents, which hopefully is not the case, but it does happen. Let's see here, your applications will then be forwarded to the Grant Advisory Committee, who will review your projects early on next year and meet sometime either February or March is the anticipated time frame. During that time, all applicants will conduct a 20-minute presentation to the committee where you'll discuss your project and have some Q&A directly with the committee. And that's your final chance to really showcase your project and make a case for why it should be recommended for funding. The recommendations from the Grant Advisory Committee are provided to the OPRD Director and to the Oregon State Parks Commission for approval to proceed with the application. After that process, and even before then, I'm working with NPS for the compliance review. There's steps, often require more information. NPS wants clarification on a few things. So good communication and quick responses are highly recommended and appreciated on both of our parts. Let's see here. So there's a lot of things that happen between the time when your application gets approved by, the Oregon State Parks and Recreation Commission to be moved forward and, before we get the notice to proceed. So there's a lot of environmental review for cultural resource surveys. There's federal compliance. The National Park Service does require pre-award site visits of the projects. There's the federal and state grant agreement. And once we have that, we go through our Department of Justice Department for legal sufficiency review of our state and local grant agreements. We route those for signature, and only until all of those steps have been completed can we award you the notice to proceed. So best case scenario is we would have an award for you by about fall of 2026. Sometimes it does take longer. Just as an example, a couple of our projects from our 2023 grant cycle were just awarded within the last month. So it does take some time depending on the complexity of your project. Okay, so project budgets. In the last several years, the National Park Service has requested more detailed budgets than they did, 10 years ago. So we want detailed, but not overly detailed. So we don't necessarily need to know the cost of every nut and bolt. We really just want you to capture the major elements in your budget. So this kind of picture here on the screen is an example of an acceptable level of detail that we'll need in the budget. We also do need you to identify if there's any pre-award costs. So you can see here, cultural resource survey is often one that is a pre-award cost, and it's going to be eligible for match in this case. Let's see here. Okay, so please refer back to these slides as you're entering the budget into the online application. Or we also have some online grant application instructions online and within the files section of the application. This is often where we see a lot of errors. So if you follow these steps, these instructions step by step, then it'll save both you and I lots of time. So to add a project budget into the online application, you'll want to start by adding only the project budget or the budget items and not worrying about any of the match at this point. So I'm going to walk you through what that looks like here. Let's see. Okay. So when you're getting ready to fill in your budget, so in this case, we have all of these items. We're getting ready to put in another line item called General Site Improvements, Install Site Furnishings. So you'll click on Add Worksheet Item. You'll provide a description of what the budget element is and enter the full cost for that item. Do not click this box here. It does weird things in the budget, so don't worry about clicking this box yet. And then add item. So you'll repeat that step until you've entered all of your project elements and their full cost. Okay, so once you've entered all of your project elements, you're going to submit, you're going to enter your match. And so for that, you're going to click the same Add Worksheet Item. Now we're going to be describing what that match source is. So in this case, it's cash. You'll enter 0 for the amount. You will click on this, does this include a match box? And this is where you're entering your total from that match source. So you'll enter, in this case, $600,000 is coming in cash from agency budgeted funds. And you'll click Add Item. So you'll repeat that if you have multiple sources of match that are not coming from another grant. If you are using match that's coming from another grant, you'll repeat those same initial steps, but this case, you'll select the box indicating that the match is coming from another grant. And a couple of different lines will appear for you to provide some information on that grant. And you'll click Item. So it's usually straightforward. I think where we see the most errors, I'm going to back up here a little bit, is as folks are entering their items for the budget, they're clicking on this little box here, which it adds little it adds lines that sometimes you can't see from your end, but they're visible on the staff side, and it makes the budget really wonky. So if you could do one thing and just maybe not click on this box until you're ready to enter your sources of match, that would save you and I a lot of time. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward here. We've already looked at that. So once you've completed those steps, this is what your budget should look like. Some of these are auto-filled. So this kind of top summary section and the bottom section are auto-filled. And if you're following the instructions exactly, there should be no weird ghost type lines, and it should look pretty clean. Okay, so moving on to match sources. Again, all applications require 50% match Having additional match beyond 50% does not necessarily give you more points. If you're going to list another grant as match and it has not yet been awarded, please make sure you're prepared to address what your plan B will be in the event that you're not successful at receiving that additional grant that you're planning to use as match. Please also address the timing of the other grant, so when the award is expected to become available, etc. All match sources need to be secured by the time that we submit the final application to the National Park Service. You cannot use any other type of federal assistance as match, with the exception of the Recreational Trails Program and the Community Development Block Grant Program. So those two are eligible to be used as match for land and water. All other sources that come from federal dollars are not eligible. And everything that you use as a match has to be an eligible item in itself. We do recognize that some costs may be incurred before a proposed project can be submitted to the National Park Service. Those types of costs are pre-award and again, must be identified in both the application and the budget. And as you're filling out the application and revision form, there's a question in there that specifically asks about pre-award costs. So you'll want to address that there as well as when they were incurred and the approximate amount. For development projects, the cost of site investigation and selection, site planning, feasibility studies, preliminary design, environmental review, those are all things that are eligible for pre-award. Similar costs may be allowable for acquisition proposals, except those relating to appraisals, surveys, and other incidental costs to the purchaser. Again, pre-award costs are not reimbursed, but are counted fully towards your match requirements. Costs that are not directly attributable to on-the-ground work are limited to 15% of the total budget, whether they were incurred pre-award or during the award period. Let's see here. Volunteer labor is an eligible source of match. It's our preference that you use volunteer or donated labor rates that are consistent with regular rates that you would typically pay general laborers for similar work by your city, district, or county. The time of a person donating services will be valued at the rate paid as a general laborer unless the person is professionally skilled in the work being performed on the project, such as a plumber working on pipes or a mason that's doing work on a brick building. In that case, use the wage rate that this individual is normally paid for performing that service. The rates for labor are fair rates, meaning no payroll additives or overhead costs may be included since the sponsor is not paying for that. If you don't have guidance for rates consistent with that activity, you can use BOLI rates. Donated materials and donated equipment is also an eligible source of match. Prices including what prices included in the matching share should be reasonable, fair market value, or fair rental value. If you have a schedule with your agency, you can use that. If you don't have a schedule, you can ask a local rental agency in your area for a rental schedule and see what that equipment would typically rent for per hour. We also can accept donated property as a match. Any application that includes the value of property should be submitted as an acquisition or as a combination application. And you would need to follow the same steps as an acquisition project. So we would need a Yellow Book appraisal and appraisal review. And you must take ownership within the grant period, not before, unless you received one of those waiver of retroactivity options that I described earlier on. Okay, so the open project selection process provides objective criteria and standards for grant selection that are explicitly based on the state's priority need for acquisition and development of outdoor recreation resources as identified in the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. The open project selection process is the connection between the SCORP and the use of Land and Water Conservation Fund grants to assist the state's effort in meeting high priority outdoor recreation resource needs. For this grant cycle, we're using our new 2025 to 2029 SCORP. This is the scoring criteria that will be applied to all applications. SCORP SCORP specific questions are identified within the application, and up to 85 points are possible for SCORP criteria, so A through H here. The committee does also have the option to award up to 15 discretionary points. The committee generally finalizes their scores at the committee where you're going to do your presentation after they've listened to you talk about your project and answered any questions that they may have. For the SCORP evaluation criteria, you can refer to Chapter 11 of the 2025-2029 SCORP. Okay. So technical review. After the application deadline, staff will conduct a technical review of each application. No points are awarded during this review, but we do in this review make notes for the committee, when it comes time for their review of the applicant's past performance and compliance with other OPRD programs. During this review, we also take a look at eligibility and completeness. We ask ourselves if the project and its elements are eligible. We make sure that all attachments have been included, and we oftentimes follow up with applicants as part of this review. The next couple of slides are an overview of the scoring criteria and questions. So starting with consistency with statewide priorities, this is a maximum of 20 points and is directly tied to the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan. So throughout the application, you will find that there's several multiple choice questions wherever possible. The responses are based from the tables provided in the SCORP, which I'll show you here in just a little bit. For this first one, this is a multiple choice, or this is a drop-down question where you're going to select whether your project is located in a close-to-home area or in a dispersed area. Applicants with projects that are located within community boundaries are instructed to use close-to-home priorities, and applicants with projects located outside of these boundaries should use dispersed setting priority. There are some circumstances where recreation providers may choose to locate recreation facilities outside of the community boundaries, which are specifically intended to serve close-to-home needs of the nearby community. If this is your case, contact me. And situations where we see something like this is if there's a lack of available land or high cost of land within the urban growth boundary. So we'll see maybe trails or access to water being developed in boundaries outside of the community. The statewide priorities were identified through two surveys. It was the survey of Oregon public recreation providers and a survey of Oregon residents. So these are the tables that you'll find in your application. So after you've selected whether your project is serving close to home priorities or if it's in a dispersed area, you'll select from multiple choice questions to let us know which of these your project will satisfy. For acquisition projects where development of outdoor recreation facilities is planned at a future date, you can respond to these next questions with the recreation uses that the land is capable of supporting or that can be achieved with minimal public investment in the interim, and priorities that will be addressed when the development takes place within 3 years after acquiring the property. The 2025-2029 SCORP builds on previous Oregon SCORP reports by evaluating specific differences in recreation behaviors, priorities, motivations, and constraints for underserved populations. The report has highlighted that key differences in recreation behaviors for underserved groups are likely explained by differences in constraints to recreation rather than different motivations or activity preferences. Therefore, the intent of this criteria is to award points to applicants who demonstrate a strong commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion by lowering barriers to outdoor recreation. And this commitment can be shown by addressing at least one of the categories shown here. So those that are linked to specific tables in the score, so bullet points 1 through 3, are multiple choice questions in the application. If they don't have a specific connection to a table, then they are narrative responses. So these last 3 are narrative, the first 3 are multiple choice, and you can select at least just one, if not all that apply. And these are just examples of some of the tables that are referenced in that question of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, so another score criteria, up to 5 points awarded here are for accessibility accommodations. Priority need is demonstrated at the statewide level for households with disabilities. To be considered for scoring points for the accessibility accommodations criteria, the project must satisfy one or more of the needs identified in Table 11.10. So this in the application is a multiple choice question. So you'll select all that apply or not applicable if your project won't satisfy some of these or any of these. Balancing conservation and recreation up to 5 points, again, directly tied to the SCORP criteria. Many places in the Oregon outdoors have been seeing record visitation in recent years. Outdoor recreation should continue to be promoted for its health and economic benefits, but increased usage can lead to overcrowding and environmental degradation, potentially reducing participation. To be considered for scoring points for this criterion, you'll explain how this project could address crowding while also decreasing the burden on current natural resources. This is a narrative type question or response in the application. Okay, local needs and benefits up to 25 points. In this question, you'll identify how the proposed project will satisfy needs identified through at least one of the 4 methods shown here. So you don't have to meet all, you just have to meet the needs in at least one of the categories. If your project has gone through multiple channels to find out the community needs, that's fantastic, and you can select all that apply. Physical activity benefits up to 5 points. So this first part here is going to be a multiple choice question in the application, and the second part will be a drop-down list. So you'll identify whether your project will satisfy any of these statewide physical activities, and then whether your project is located in one of these priority counties. Universal design and inclusive outdoor recreation opportunities up to 10 points. The SCORP recommends that park amenities and features should be planned with universal design principles. This approach can help address barriers related to personal health and accessibility that were found to be especially prominent for low-income residents and households with disabilities. We're looking for projects that exceed beyond the minimum ADA requirements and strive to incorporate universal design concepts and design considerations. This response in the application is narrative. The need for major rehabilitation, again, another SCORP directly related criteria, up to 5 points. Funding for facility or rehabilitation replacement was a top issue identified with both within the UGB and dispersed areas. Major rehabilitation projects involve the restoration or partial reconstruction of eligible recreation areas and facilities necessitated by one or more of the selections shown here and are not attributed to the lack of maintenance. Be sure to upload photos of if be sure to upload photos in the attachments showing facilities that are in need of the rehabilitation and let us know approximately the percentage of the project that is rehabilitation or restoration. Okay, so this next set of criteria is not directly attributed to the priorities that are identified through surveys in the scope, but you do get evaluated and scored for these. So 5 points for community support. For this section, letters of support are a great way to demonstrate support and or partnership. It's best if you stick within 3 to 5 original letters from volunteer organizations, neighborhood associations, community members, etc., that strongly support your project. And match up to 10 points financial commitment. Here's where you can explain what your plan B is if your source of funding doesn't come through, for instance, if you're waiting on another grant. Um, so that's where you'll talk about that. You'll want to upload a copy of a resolution to apply, which dedicates local match funding and identifies long-term maintenance for the project. Okay, sustainability up to 5 points. With this, we want to understand how or if sustainability was considered in the intent, strategies, and long-term plans for the project. In this grant cycle, one of our new scoring criteria is the readiness to proceed up to 5 points. OPRD intends to ensure that available grant funds are used in a timely manner and appropriate local land use and consistent zoning are applied to the property once funding is awarded to a project applicant. Grant Advisory Committee members will determine a value from 0 to 5 points based on information provided by the applicant related to the degree to which the project is ready to proceed based on the status of zoning, design plans, and required permits. As you're completing your application, there's several attachments that will be required. And you'll see if you have not fulfilled the attachments, if you haven't uploaded anything, say under construction drawings, you'll find a little exclamation mark. And if you've uploaded a document, then you should see a green check arrow. The system will not let you submit if there are any that are missing attachments. So sometimes there may be an attachment that is not really applicable to your project. Maybe you don't have something to upload for additional attachment. Again, the system won't let you submit if there's nothing in that section. So for that case, you'll want to just upload a, a Microsoft Word document saying NA, and that should allow the system to push the application through. Also, another note here is to keep any form that we've provided in its original format. So the application and revision form, I talked a lot about that form. It's a Word document. Please keep it as a Word document because there are a lot of revisions that need to be made, or there's some questions that I need to directly answer. So if you could please keep those in their original format, that would be very helpful. I'm going to pause there because the next couple of slides talk about the committee that reviews the projects. Are there any questions?
None that haven't been answered yet.
Awesome. Okay. So the Oregon Outdoor Recreation Committee is our grant advisory committee. It's a 9-member group that serves 4-year terms. Members are appointed by the Oregon Parks and Recreation Director and represent various interests as established in the Oregon administrative rules for this program. After your application passes through the technical review step, it will be forwarded to the Oregon Outdoor Recreation Committee. Applicants must make a presentation to the committee. The date for that is still to be determined. But thinking somewhere around February or March. Presenters have 20 minutes to make presentations and answer questions. And we usually recommend that you allow 7 to 10 minutes for your for your presentation and leave the rest of the time for questions from the committee. By the time that you're presenting to the committee, they will have already reviewed your application. So just driving home the key points of your project. And again, it's your final chance to explain why your project should be funded. And PowerPoint is usually the most common type of presentation that we see. The committee will evaluate applications and vote on a ranked list of projects to recommend for funding. That list goes to our director and to the Oregon Parks and Recreation Commission for approval to move them forward in the process. Okay, and then just a couple of resources. I've mentioned our Land and Water website a couple of times. So I wanted to share the link to that and show you a couple of things that you can find on there. We have resources, forms. The schedule will be updated as dates are identified for a couple of these. So the committee meeting and the meeting when our commission will vote on the projects will be filled in once we know what those dates are. We also have the pre-application worksheets that I've mentioned. Those are available under the application and forms section on the page, and they're ready for you now if you wanted to take a look. Again, they consist of most, if not all, of the questions that you'll find in the actual online application. We do highly recommend starting with these worksheets just because oftentimes or sometimes there may be a glitch in our system and your responses could get deleted. So having a record just in case that happens so that you can simply copy and paste will save you a lot of time. We also recommend using these just to keep a count of your word count. We recommend keeping narrative responses in the application to less than 400 words, if at all possible, just because our committee as well as staff have a high volume of applications to review. And so, making the response up front rather than kind of burying it in the fluff is not something we recommend. And then one of the other things I wanted to identify on here, there's a link on our website to a map, and I'll show it on the next slide. It's an interactive map of our land and water sites across the state. This is a great tool to use if you're planning a new project, especially if it's one not necessarily for this grant cycle, but maybe it's one that may not be directly related to outdoor recreation. It's a good way to just quickly see if your park is already encumbered by the Land and Water Conservation Fund program. So I'm going to run through just a really quick example of how to work that tool. So when you click on the link on our website, or in this PowerPoint, it'll take you to kind of this pop-up that lets you know the boundaries, may not be exact. So just to contact us if you have questions. I'm going to zoom in here to an example in Woodburn. So this is a public-facing map, and you can check out any and all boundaries in Oregon, but here's one. So the information that you'll see if you click on a boundary is you'll get a list of which agreements it's tied to, specifically for land and water. You can click on these and kind of, well, this one is missing some, but you can see this is an improvement type of project, and sometimes it'll tell you the year. So in this one doesn't, but you can find some pretty general information about the project or about the park. You can also look for boundaries, not just by zooming in, but by selecting or by clicking or entering the park name. So I'm going to enter this example, Legion Park in Woodburn, Oregon. That'll take me directly to that park. And again, you can click and find some great information about that. This one does have some more details. So it looks like this agreement was back from the 80s. There's a link here called Oprah's link This link is not available to external users. It's directly for internal staff. It takes you to our internal system, so that won't be available. But all of the other information should be public facing. The other way that you can look for grants is by clicking on this little magnifying glass. If you have the federal number, so the federal grant number usually starts with 41, you can click that or enter that here. If you have the state and local grant agreement, which usually starts with OP or with WP, you can enter that there and click apply. And then the other way that you can search is if you're zooming out and there's this little arrow here, it'll let you know what's within the frame. So if I zoom out some more, you can see that the table grows and gives me more information as to which boundaries are in my frame. And that can change as I zoom in or out. So it's a pretty neat map. You can see there's different types of maps you can choose from depending on the view you're looking for. And using the layers, there's a historical layer view, which tells you if there's been any changes to the boundary map. So for instance, I'm going to pick Drake Park in Bend, Oregon. You can see with that layer on, there's some green and some yellow. So yellow indicates the most recent up-to-date boundary that we have for the park. Green may indicate either a conversion occurred. In this case, it's this park started off with acquisition way back in the day. And so you can see these parcels were some of the first that were protected by the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act. And as the park expanded and they applied for more grants, that boundary has now changed to something larger. So just a tool for you to use if you have questions about boundaries in Oregon. Moving on. Okay. And then these are just some of the resources and information that you'll find within your application online. Some of these are out of date in the example, but in there you'll find resources, guidance, forms, policies, and much, much more. Okay. Application tips, getting started early. Again, recommending that you start with the pre-application worksheets on the website. Highly recommend that you keep a backup of your responses. Read and follow instructions using our state manual. There's online applications. You could download a copy of today's presentation slides, and the recording will also be made available. So as you're completing your application, responding to the questions in a concise manner. Again, staff and committee members have a limited time to spend reading the materials, so you'll always want to start by answering questions right away and not getting into the history or the background of the park or the project itself. Making sure that every word is conveying an important point to the grant reviewer. So if it's not relevant, probably you might want to consider leaving it out. And as you're attaching any documents to your application, avoiding pretty heavy, voluminous documents unless there's a really good reason why you're including that document and you've stated that in your application. And then just being patient. This is a federal program. There's a lot of review steps. There's a lot of compliance hoops that we need to fulfill. And so things do tend to take a lot longer than some of our other non-federally funded programs, especially around federal compliance like the environmental review and cultural resource review. So examples of what makes a good project. So project readiness is a big one. Having all of the necessary federal permits in time by the time that we're applying to National Park Service, which is a few months away, but just starting that process earlier on and investigating whether a permit will even be required for your project. Making sure that your match is secured and identified within the application. And of course, one of the big pieces of the application is the boundary map. So ensuring that there's enough information in the map and in your records that will allow you to commit that park or that entire boundary area for perpetual compliance. A couple of things to be mindful of as you're preparing your application. So, if you have a scope of work that's not maybe well defined and is subject to significant changes, you'll want to talk to me, and we can both consider whether this is a good time to apply for land and water, or if perhaps you could wait for the next grant cycle. We usually offer a grant cycle each year around the same time in the fall. You'll need to be mindful of if there's any open compliance issues that haven't been resolved with the land and water projects in the past, or maybe any of the other applications that you have going on with some of our other recreation grant programs. Being mindful if there's parks that have received funding, maybe not necessarily the one that you're applying for funds for, but that maybe have that they don't have public access, because that's part of the compliance review that we're doing, making sure that you're still compliant with your past obligations, especially in land and water. Submitting inaccurate maps or documents is something to be mindful of, disclosing all pertinent information, and then just a reminder not to begin any ground disturbing work or acquiring of the property before receiving notice to proceed. Common pitfalls that we see. So, proofreading is highly important. If you're using tools such as AI to complete your application, that's fine, but just making sure that you're reviewing your responses before submitting. There have been instances where we've seen references to the AI tool in the response, which just kind of gives an indication that maybe proofreading was overlooked. So just making sure that you're aware of that, and that if you are using AI, that it's producing responses that reflect an accurate scope of work, acceptable design, and your goals that you're intending to let us know through the application. Another common pitfall that we sometimes see is inaccurate or unrealistic budgeting. Maybe you're not requesting enough funds. So if you have questions about how much you can request, contact me. Again, we don't have a maximum amount. You just can't request the entire bucket. So in this grant round, again, we're estimating between 10 or maybe $11 million available for funding. Timing is really important in having open communication. There's a lot of times where NPS is asking for information, and I need to get a hold of you to get that information back to them in a timely manner. So just making sure we both have open channels of communication. Okay, so we're nearing the end of the presentation here. What to expect if your project is recommended for funding? Pre-award inspections are required as part of our submittals to National Park Service. And in the past, just depending on the volume of applications we receive and how far the projects are located, I may conduct the pre-award inspection even before the Grant Advisory Committee meets, just to get ahead of some of those steps. We also will be finalizing all required documents that we'll need to include in our official submittal to National Park Service, including any maps, consultations, and any other federal forms. And something to keep in mind is that usually there tends to be a bigger request of the program than there are funds available. So the most important thing you can remember is there's no perfect application. Sometimes great applications still don't get recommended for funding, and usually the case is because there's not enough funds. So not to get discouraged, just find out why. After you have received the award, you can expect to submit regular progress reports and requests for reimbursement. You'll need to keep accurate record keeping. And again, this is a reimbursement grant, so you'll pay for the project expenses up front and request reimbursement from us. We do withhold 25% of the grant amount as retainage. until project completion has been verified. There are long-term compliance responsibilities, especially because this is a perpetual program with perpetual requirements. So things like keeping the LWCF boundary intact and making sure everything that goes on within the boundary once the project is done is in compliance with the intention of the act, so public outdoor recreation. Making sure that the property remains attractive and inviting to the public, it's safe, and that you make any reasonable repairs. And of course, keeping it open at reasonable hours and times of the year. The program does require signing, so signing, acknowledging the land and water program, and we do provide signs at no cost to you if you're interested in those. And let's see, so here's a couple of links of great resources, and my contact information again is here at the bottom. And that brings us to the questions. And actually, I'll back up just a little bit. In the past, let's see, here it is. So the National Park Service has provided a PDF manual. They recently changed, and so the manual is now based online, and I'll show you here. So it's not downloadable, unfortunately. So if you have questions about the federal manual, there's no PDF, but you can peruse through the sections of the manual through this online section. And as they provide any updates to it, they will be provided on their page here using these links below. So, okay. So that brings us to the end of the presentation, and let's open it for questions.
All right. Thanks, Naomi. No questions yet, so folks, get your questions in if you would like. There's also the raise hand function if there's a question you'd rather ask verbally for any reason. And then Naomi, I am answering a question right now from Philip. He was asking, he was looking at our website and the past project list, only going through 2018, asking if we have more recent ones. I let him know. I know we have them. I know it's on your list to get them up there. But I'll say that folks can email you or email Naomi if you'd like a list of more recent projects, and she can get you those lists from our commission briefs because those links just changed. So it's a little tricky to point you there right at the moment.
And I can work on updating the list here within the next week. It should be up there.
Great. And a thank you from someone. Thank you for tuning in.
I will also mention that on our website, there's an option to sign up to receive any email updates on land and water or information. So it's just sending me an email. I can get you on my list, and I share just news about land and water as they come out. So I'll just bring over my screen here. So here's a little blurb. You can sign up for email updates, and I have a list of maybe 30 people on that list already. So if that's something you're interested in, send me an email and I can get you added.
All
Okay,
right,
so
good. Oh, you got it already?
yes. Okay, so question in the Q&A. So can you briefly discuss pros and cons of LWCF versus local government grant program for folks who have projects that would be eligible for both? So I would say a big pro is that both programs can match each other, and we've seen that quite a bit with applications. So where maybe you'll apply for local government because they open their grant cycle a few months ahead of us. So applying for a project there, usually you would know by September when the commission meets if your project was approved for funding. And so that's perfect timing for the time, when you need to submit your application to Land and Water for, say, the matching funds for that project, or vice versa. We've also had projects apply to Land and Water in the fall and then apply to local government a few months later after they open in January. So I would say a pro would be if your park has previously received funds from LWCF and it's already encumbered by the requirements of the program, then um, you're not adding a new boundary. So using funding again from Land and Water is probably a great idea just because you're not committing any new property to the program. Um, I guess the con would be just because it's a federally funded program, there's a lot more hoops that we need to jump through, and the grant award might take a lot longer than it does with the local government grant program. Are there any other things you can think of, Jody or Michelle?
Yeah, and I don't know if you already said this, but LWCF has been less competitive. So your likelihood of funding is a little bit higher, probably with local government, depending. And also local government. So while Land and Water has a 50% match requirement, local government has more of what you might call like a sliding scale, where or cities and counties under a certain population can actually get a little bit lower of a match requirement. I know Michelle could probably correct me, but between like 20 and 40% if they're below a certain population threshold.
That's correct. And then I don't know if either of you already said this, but there is no maximum grant. Like in the
Mm.
local government grant program, the maximum grant award is $1 million. There is no maximum in LWCF set except for what's available, as Naomi mentioned earlier in her presentation.
Yep,
And
no,
the
thank you. Yeah, that wasn't mentioned, so good catch.
Yeah, and the other thing with
Mhm.
local government is there's a limit to how many open applications or projects you can have at one time. The limit is two. With Land and Water, there is no limit.
Great. Couple other questions. One is if we use LWCF to help us acquire property, do we need to fully develop it within 3 years or any time frame?
We do need development to take place within 3 years, and you can always come back to the program for funds to help you with the development. So, with the acquisition application, we just ask for a general idea of what you might develop, knowing, with the understanding that, of course, things can change as you go through your public process, but we do
Mhm.
need some type of development.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I noticed
so
too
it
in the,
wouldn't
oh, go ahead, Michelle.
it wouldn't
Mhm.
necessarily be when you say fully develop, it doesn't need to be like if you have a long range perk plan, it doesn't need to be fully developed, but there does need to be enough development there to make the property open and have some activities for the public.
Mhm.
Great, that's what I was
Sorry,
going to
Jody.
say. Nope, thanks, Michelle. You got it. And then there's a question. I might need some more follow-up information, but I'll give a hypothetical here. So there's a potential project that's on a site with 3 public agencies with joint ownership. Do we see this as a problem? And let's answer that first, assuming all 3 of those agencies are eligible for LWCF. Would it be possible for one of those entities to submit and then have all 3 owners involved in the application and documents?
Yes, yep. If there's joint ownership, we would need all of the agencies involved, in the ownership to co-sponsor the application. So they would each sign the land and water boundary map that would commit the property, perpetually, and yeah, provide resolution to apply. And then if there's some type of agreement between the agencies as far as, managing or applying, we would need to know that information, but we can get into those details individually.
Mhm. Yep. But yeah, and I'd say if there's like one of those owners is a land trust or a federal agency, that's where it might not work, just if they're not all eligible.
Yeah.
Anything else? Oh, Okay, he did say they are all local agencies, so yeah. Then you would go with what Naomi said.
And like Naomi said, she
Mhm.
could go into more specifics, but I will say that one of those entities needs to be the applicant and recipient of the funds. So, we can't divvy out funds to different agencies. So as long as you have the one identified as the sponsor.
All right, nothing else. And I know folks already have Naomi's email, and like has been said many times, most projects have their own little unique aspects of it that's good to connect with Naomi about, or any of us grant coordinators, depending on the program. Oh, we have a question from Philip. I'll unmute you.
Thanks. I just want to say thanks to you guys, but I also hate to be the one asking lots of questions, but I do something I think you said, Noemi, I just want to understand is I thought you said there was one application that was from like 23 and did they just receive the notice to proceed?
I think that was 2023.
2023, yeah.
And Naomi, you're on mute in case you were trying to answer.
Oh, yes, I was trying to answer.
Okay.
Thanks, Jody. Yes, so a couple of our applications from our 2023 grant cycle just received their award not too long ago. And so these were projects with cultural resource work that needed to be done. So it took a little bit longer, and that was mostly the reason for the delay.
Mhm. And I will just say, just to acknowledge it too, those were also impacted by some of the federal stuff happening this year. While Naomi was out working with some of the feds and lost some of the staff, but things seem to be working more normal now.
Mhm.
You want to take that one, Naomi, about whether we do this on an annual basis and what future funding looks like?
Yes. So question, is the program available on an annual basis? Yes, it is. We usually, with the exception of last year, because I was on leave for quite some time, we do anticipate offering a grant cycle fall of each year. So far, we have not been told that there's any risk to our funding. So for now, business as usual. And yeah, well, you can expect another grant cycle fall of next year.
Well, I'll steal a minute then too, just to make a plug for the webinar I'm hosting tomorrow. That's going to be very similar to this, but about our federally funded recreational trails program, which was supposed to open last week. It's slightly delayed just with some issues on our website. But if you want to learn about that program, you can follow those links we shared to get to our website and tune in to that one. And that will be all trails focused.
While we're waiting to see if more questions come in, I'm going to bring up the slide that shows our other grant programs and when their applications are open and due, just in case you're interested. Again, Land and Water can match some of these. So recreational trails program, local government, and county opportunity. We've seen a lot of applications in the past using these resources, to match one another. So if you have questions about how to do that, contact me. happy to help you puzzle some pieces together. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. I think folks might be ready for lunch. So I think we'll stop the webinar here. And of course, if there's any questions that you think of after, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to help you. Thank you all for your time this afternoon or this morning.